cockroaches can build very, very large populations. In turn, they produce both allergens and they produce all sorts of biocontaminants.
This is the Discovery Files podcast from the U.S. National Science Foundation. I'm Nate Podker. Insects play vital roles in the ecosystems of the world, from pollination to decomposition of plant and animal matter, or as a food source for other animals. But some species can be pests, and home infestations of any sort can pose serious health threats. We are joined today by Coby Schal, the Blanton J. Whitmer Distinguished Professor of Entomology at North Carolina State University. Dr. Schal has spent his career investigating the biology and management of urban pests, with a specialty in cockroaches, as well as chemical ecology, especially pheromones, and other attractants of cockroaches and, more recently, moths. Dr. Schal, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
So I like to start going back a little bit. How did you first get interested in entomology?
So I went to the State University of New York at Albany as a pre-med. And my first semester taught me that pre-med was not my path. As the courses turned to zoology and animal behavior and such, I fell in love with that. And my grades shot up. And I absolutely fell in love with insects and decided to follow that path.
What is the difference for people that don't quite get it between a moth and a butterfly?
So butterflies emerged or evolved from moths. They diverged, that butterfly lineage diverged from the moth lineage about 100 million years ago or so. And there are broad differences between them. The moths are generally, with some exceptions, they're generally nocturnal, whereas the butterflies are generally diurnal, almost always diurnal. And so they use very different sensory modalities in their mate finding, for example. Of course, we also know that many moths are very important agricultural pests, but there are very few butterflies that become pests. Think of monarch butterflies. They eat milkweed, which is actually a weed. They're incredibly charismatic. They're beautiful. We know so much about their biology. Oftentimes, the moth species, things like the fall armyworm or corn earworm, those tend to be very important global pests.
So thinking about them as pests, I think a lot of us are familiar with like mothballs in our closets to like protect sweaters or something like that. But what kind of crops are they feeding on that create problems?
Well, some moths feed on, they're incredibly prolificous. Poly, many, phagous, eat. So they eat many different plant species in many different genera, many of which are agricultural crops. So again, the fall armyworm is arguably the number one global pest now because we've actually exported the fall armyworm from the United States to Africa.
Perfect.
It jumped from Africa. It's all through sub-Saharan Africa. Mm-hmm. It jumped from Africa to Southeast Asia, into China, from China into the Pacific Islands, into Australia. So it's truly a global pest now. And it feeds, the latest count is something like 350 species of plants. Again, many of which are major crops globally, so corn, rice, sorghum, you name it, the fall armyworm feeds on it. And there are many other similar pests that are global in nature and feed on a lot of very important crops, all the way from corn to wheat to cotton.
Wow, pretty universal as an issue then for anyone growing anything. So the last kind of idea I want to touch on with the moths, are there anything beneficial about them? Because we're talking about them being pests and being problem for crops, but is there anything we don't think of that's a hidden benefit?
Well, certainly there are some moth species that are very important in industry. There's some moths that make silk, and the silk industry is very, very important. Natural silk is very important, especially in Japan, China, and other Asian countries. There are some moths in every insect group. there are some beneficials and some pests. Think of what we call the Hymenoptera, the bees. They're some that are very, obviously very beneficial, and some can damage your home. For example, the carpenter bee. Even though they damage your home, they're still beneficial in nature. Mm-hmm. So there are some examples of both butterflies and moths that do the same.
Moving into your background with the cockroaches, is there any benefits to cockroaches? That might be a fun place to start.
Cockroaches are incredibly diverse. When we humans think of cockroaches, we usually think of a handful of pest cockroaches. The diversity of cockroaches is about 5,000 species. There are about 5,000 species of cockroaches that have been described. Only about 5 to 10 cockroach species are truly pests in human habitats. Most of what we call pests are actually cockroaches that live outside. They're quite beneficial outside and occasionally come into the home. But there are a couple of species, most importantly the German cockroach, Platella dramatica, that has become so adapted and so obligatory in its adaptation to humans. Right. That it lives only in human habitats, and it completely lost its natural habitat. There are no known populations of the German cockroaches outside of human habitats. So that's truly a pest of humans, an obligatory pest of humans, much like, there's some other examples of insects that don't live anywhere else except with humans. But again, the vast majority of cockroach species live in nature, have nothing to do with humans. I can give you examples. We have worked on the sex pheromone of a very interesting cockroach called the woods cockroaches. That's a genus Parvoblata. And in the southeastern United States, that cockroach genus and species within that genus comprise 50% of the diet of the red cockaded woodpecker, which is an endangered species of bird. So cockroaches in their native habitats serve very important functions as decomposers of the leaf litter, especially food for other animals in the food chain. So for birds, for reptiles, they're really quite important in that sense. In the tropics, there are some examples of cockroaches that serve as pollinators of some plants.
So I wanted to ask you about their kind of allergen status. There's a lecture you did online where you're really talking about it, and it's interesting the kind of minimal amount you need to create that issue.
Yeah, so this is a very important and very underappreciated aspect about the German cockroach and a couple of other species of cockroaches that, like the American cockroach, that live in close proximity to humans. The German cockroach especially lives only in our homes, and if it's not controlled, the German cockroach can reach very large populations, very large infestation sizes in people's homes. Now, in most people's homes, they control those cockroaches, but if you live in a resource limited community, if you're in a low income community where you cannot afford to bring in pest control companies to control the cockroaches can build to very large populations. In turn, they produce both allergens and they defecate in the environment. They produce all sorts of biocontaminants that affect human health. We're extensively studying those, and in addition to the allergens that cockroaches produce, they also produce their gut is full of microbes, bacteria, and fungi. And as they defecate into the human environment, those fungi can produce mycotoxins, toxins produced by fungi that can affect human health. So the human environment, the indoor environment in the cockroach-infested home can become sort of a a very bad environment for human health. And especially children and the elderly can become sensitized to these cockroach allergens. Sensitization means that when you are exposed to these allergens, you respond to them with an allergic response. And oftentimes that can be an asthmatic response. So asthmatic children especially in urban low-income communities, the prevalence of asthma is much higher, and they respond to the cockroach allergens that oftentimes send them to the emergency room because of asthmatic episodes.
What are the best strategies to kind of treating cockroaches? Like, there's a lot of different kind of baits. You can, like, if anyone who's ever walked down the aisle and seen the baits, there's a lot of different kinds of options. Are there any that you've found to be more effective?
Because this is a very confusing area, because, as you said, you go down the aisle in the supermarket or in a hardware store, or for that matter on Amazon, you find just a plethora of all sorts of gizmos, some of which are totally ineffective. And unfortunately, municipalities often invest in these very ineffective products like acoustic devices, ultrasonic devices that emit ultrasound with the hope of repelling cockroaches. Cockroaches actually don't respond to any of these. And in fact, they like to harbor inside those ultrasonic emitting gizmos because they're warm inside, and cockroaches do like warm. For many, many years, for many decades, we have relied on spray insecticides, where we treat the environment with sprays to control cockroaches. Those can be effective. However, they tend to use a lot of insecticides in the residential environment. So I have very, very much worked on trying to develop ecologically sound strategies of controlling cockroaches. And the most ecologically sound way to do it, and the most efficacious way to do it, is to use baits. Back in around mid-1980s, companies started coming up with what we refer to as gel baits. They're often dispensed in a syringe, and we put little dabs of this bait around where cockroaches are found, or around where we see evidence of cockroaches, like the cockroach feces, for example. Those baits, the vast majority of them, independent of the manufacturer or the insecticide that's in them, tend to be very effective, because cockroaches are omnivorous. They eat anything in the environment, many things in the environment, and those baits are tasty to them. So cockroaches, as long as the bait is placed close to where the cockroach is, the cockroach will venture out and eat that bait. If it's an effective insecticide, the cockroach will die. So the gel baits have really revolutionized and transformed the way we do pest control. We use very little insecticide, and we get very high efficacy without really contaminating the environment. In the context of contaminating the environment, we had done a project a number of years ago to look at what are called bug bombs. Sometimes they're called total release
the spray. Right.
Yeah, they're very militaristic. They're almost like a grenade, right? Yep. You deploy this thing and you leave the house and you come back 4 hours later, and you see what appear to be dead cockroaches. But if you put those cockroaches in the garbage, and the next day you look in the garbage and they're gone, because cockroaches have recovered from that insecticide and survived the treatment. Those are very polluting treatments. We have shown that they're incredibly inefficacious. There's no point releasing so much insecticide in a home. There may be places where that's okay, maybe the crawl space, maybe some places where those types of applications may be okay, but the home environment should be protected from the broad dissemination of insecticides. And in terms of efficacy, those products are incredibly inefficacious whereas the bait products tend to be very efficacious.
So I wanted to pivot a little bit while I had you and ask you about the impact that NSF funding has had on your career.
Yeah, NSF has been tremendously important, not just for my career, but for training people in my lab. I've trained about 40 PhD students, some of whom were funded by NSF, and some of them actually had NSF pre-doctoral fellowships that got them through their PhD. That was incredibly important. The same applies to postdocs. I've had about 40 plus postdocs in the lab. And again, a good number of them, some of them have been funded by NSF postdoctoral fellowships. This especially applies to minority fellowships, minority students, or African American, Native Americans, women especially. My career goes back to 40 years ago when there are very few women in this field, and NSF was very supportive of bringing minorities, bringing women into what is an agricultural field for the most part, and was very male-dominated. That has changed tremendously with NSF support. Most recently, we discovered that that the German cockroach has evolved a resistance to these baked products that we use, and that resistance, instead of becoming resistant to the insecticide, they've mutated their sense of taste. A concept called glucose aversion, and NSF has supported us on uncovering this, the mechanism of this glucose aversion. It turns out to be one of the best understood mechanism of behavioral resistance in insects. So this is it's been a good investment in that. This example has made itself into textbooks on the evolution of behavioral resistance in insects.
I'm sure that's very cool or very satisfactory to see your work impacting things in that manner.
Yes, I think the work, the NSF-funded work, has impacted, of course, us in terms of being able to do the work, the trainees that have gone through the program, but even much broader, the work has impacted the translation of our work to products that industry uses. So the discovery of chemicals involved in communication, those have been translated to products that industry uses. The discovery of glucose aversion in cockroaches, that is translated to alerting the industry that there are some cockroaches that will not respond to the baits that they produce. So the industry has changed the formulation of these baits. In a much broader sense, we engage quite a bit in community outreach. So we do a lot of community outreach, both in schools, in elementary schools, for example, but also we have this amazing museum here in Raleigh, the Museum of Natural Sciences. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had our annual Buckfest event. The Buckfest event is the biggest entomological event in the world. We engage families, we engage kids, we engage, you name it. People come to learn about insects. And invariably, people ask us, "Oh, how do you control them? I see silverfish in my house. How do you control those?" So we engage the community about insects in general, not just the insects that we directly work.
And that's a great way to do it, because you get the people that are scared of insects, you get people that are fascinated with insects, and they kind of either group gets an excellent opportunity, presuming to interact with like them in cages and just to learn from you guys about all of these aspects of them.
And we shouldn't forget that a lot of our field work with moths is in agricultural fields. And it's a very isolated endeavor. We work out there in the field by ourselves. But our work with cockroaches is in low-income communities in Raleigh and so in the larger metropolitan area here. And we engage the community. So we teach people how to control cockroaches. We teach them about the dangers of having cockroaches. So this is this is actually a very important undertaking to get community involvement and community participation in the work we do in people's homes.
Special thanks to Coby Schal. For the Discovery Files, I'm Nate Podker. Discover how the U.S. National Science Foundation is advancing research at nsf.gov.